This room isn't for people like you."
The words weren't loud, but they echoed endlessly in the mind of the 13-year-old girl wearing a frayed wool coat and torn sneakers. The one who said them was a junior student, standing near the blackboard in the hallway of Sterling Memorial Library, the heart of Yale University. The one being spoken to was her, the gatekeeper's daughter. Each night, as the city of New Haven fell asleep, her father quietly pedaled his bicycle to Yale. He was the night janitor at Marsh Lecture Hall. She had been accompanying him since she was 8. Not by choice, but because there was no one else to look after her mother died in a factory accident. Her father didn't want to leave her alone at home. While he worked, she sat in empty hallways or unused classrooms, poring over math books or reading discarded lecture notes her father had rescued from trash bins. The pages were filled with strange symbols and words, limits, gradients, integrals. But instead of frightening her, they glowed like small lanterns in the cold dark. They were steady rhythms that drowned out hunger and her father's coughs. Her school was just 5 blocks from Yale, a public school for children of immigrants and laborers where college was rarely discussed. But she was different. Quietly, she solved problems from advanced textbooks, asked her father to bring home sheets from the library printer, and pressed her ear to the doors of evening classes. One night, as her father mopped the floors near the mathematics building, she overheard a lecture for an advanced course in calculus. She stayed still, eyes fixed on the chalkboard. The professor was speaking of higher order changes, infinite sums, and the idea of functions that could be smoothed out forever. Every phrase made her heart beat faster. She copied notes into her small notebook, careful as though she were handling treasure. And it was in that hallway that she was discovered. "You don't have a student ID. You're not supposed to be here," a student said. He wore a polished hoodie and a smartwatch. When his eyes fell on her worn shoes, a half-smile curled on his lips. "This room isn't for a janitor's kid." She lowered her head, but her eyes clung to the board. That night, she said nothing. But back home, as her father reheated potato soup on a small oil stove, she sat quietly for a long time and then asked, "Dad, what does it take to get into Yale?" Her father paused. He looked at his daughter, frail, with eyes burning strangely bright, and gently replied, "Probably a lot, honey. But if you really want it, I'll find a way." Outside, snow began to fall gently. Inside the small basement room where the warmth from the oil stove had yet to reach, a dream quietly took shape. Not for today, not even for tomorrow. But one day, she would no longer have to peek through a crack in the door. The winter sun was pale above New Haven, casting long shadows across the Gothic courtyards of Yale. For students hurrying to class, it was just another Monday morning. For her, it felt like stepping into a different world, a world of marble arches, stained glass, and voices that carried the careless certainty of privilege. The girl was 13, too young to be enrolled, too poor to belong. Yet here she was, sitting in the back row of an advanced calculus class. She had slipped in quietly, carrying a notebook that once belonged to her mother, its pages already half filled with her neat handwriting. The professor began with basic reminders about integrals, then moved quickly into series expansions, limits, and the delicate rules of convergence. Her pencil scratched across the paper with intensity, recording each step, pausing only to whisper the meaning under her breath. "Janitor's kid." The whisper came from 2 rows ahead. She ignored it. "Farm girl doesn't even know what a derivative is." Another laugh. She kept writing. By the 3rd remark, the laughter spread to a cluster of wealthy students sitting near the window. They were dressed in designer coats, sleek boots, and scarves the color of new snow. She felt her cheeks flush. Her own coat was patched at the elbows, a dull gray, with a missing button she had replaced with thread from her father's old shirt. She tightened her grip on the pencil. "Why don't you show us your shoes?" one boy sneered, glancing at the sneakers that had split along the seams. "Maybe the holes are growing faster than any equation can describe." The group burst into laughter. Even a few students who hadn't joined in before now chuckled quietly, as though afraid of missing the joke. Her ears burned, but her eyes never left the board. The professor had just written down the expansion of the exponential function, showing how it could be expressed as an infinite sum. The elegance of the idea calmed her. While others smirked, she repeated silently to herself, "Focus, focus." Yet no matter how tightly she concentrated, the laughter dug into her. These were students whose parents could buy textbooks as easily as a morning coffee, whose biggest worry was an upcoming exam. For her, every page of math was won through hunger. Every pencil stub carried the weight of sacrifice. When the lecture ended, she tried to slip out quietly, but the group was waiting by the door. "So," the tallest boy said, blocking her path, "are you planning to clean the classroom now? Or just steal more notes from the trash?" Her throat tightened. She could have walked away, but something within her stirred. Perhaps it was the long nights watching her father mop floors while she clutched equations to her chest. Perhaps it was the thought of her mother, whose hands once turned pages for her before they fell silent on the factory floor. She straightened her shoulders. "I came here to learn," she said softly. For a moment there was silence. Then came the laughter again, louder, harsher, echoing off the stone walls. One girl with diamond earrings leaned close and whispered, "Learning? People like you don't learn here. People like you clean here." The words struck harder than the cold outside. That evening she sat in the janitor's closet while her father worked. The smell of detergent mixed with the faint scent of chalk dust. Her notebook lay open on her lap, filled with equations that seemed to blur with her tears. "Why do they hate me, Papa?" she finally asked when her father came in, pushing the mop aside. Her father removed his cap, sat beside her on the wooden stool, and sighed. "They don't hate you. They fear you." "Fear me? I'm just me." "You're someone who sees what they can't," he said gently. "You're someone who studies not because you must, but because you love it. And that is dangerous to those who think knowledge belongs only to them." His words sank deep, like warm water seeping into frozen ground. She wiped her eyes, closed her notebook, and whispered, "Then I'll keep learning, even if they laugh." Her father smiled faintly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small eraser, worn but still usable. "Your mother once used this. She would want you to keep writing no matter how many mistakes the world tells you you've made." She held the eraser in her palm as though it were a jewel. The next day, she returned to class. Again, whispers followed her. Again, the laughter trailed behind. But this time, she sat taller. The professor was discussing integrals that stretch to infinity, asking the class to decide for which numbers the answer remains finite, and for which it grows without bound. Silence spread. Many students avoided eye contact, uncertain of the answer. The professor waited. Her hand twitched, almost rising, but the memory of laughter pressed it down. Instead, she solved it silently in her notebook. It converged only when the number was greater than 1. She closed her eyes. The answer glowed on the page. But she said nothing. Over the next weeks, the pattern repeated. Learning, whispering, laughter, silence. Each jeer chipped at her, yet each concept built her back up. By the time spring edged into the city, her notebook was filled with careful proofs, margins lined with reminders in her tidy script. And though no one knew it yet, the girl who was mocked as Janitor's kid was preparing for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. The day would come when she would raise her hand, and the laughter would stop. Spring had arrived in New Haven, though the air still carried a chill that clung to the stone walls of Yale. For the girl, spring meant longer evenings following her father through the lecture halls, her notebook always tucked beneath her arm, ready to catch whatever knowledge might fall within reach. One morning, the campus buzzed with excitement. Flyers were posted across the college. A world-renowned mathematician was visiting Yale to give a public lecture. His work was considered legendary, an elegant proof that had dazzled conferences around the world. Professors quoted it, graduate students studied it, and journals printed it with reverence. For most students, the guest lecture was just another event in the calendar. But for her, it was as if a door had swung open onto a new universe. She wanted desperately to hear every word, though she knew she would not be welcome. That evening, her father was assigned to clean near the lecture hall where the event would be held. She clutched his sleeve, whispering, "Please, let me stay close." He looked into her eyes, so full of hope, so fragile, and sighed. "Stay at the back, quiet as a shadow. If anyone asks, you are helping me." When the hall doors opened, waves of students poured inside. They were dressed in tailored coats and polished shoes, their laughter echoing beneath the high arches. She slipped in behind them and found a seat in the farthest row. Her coat was patched, her shoes nearly split, yet in that moment she did not care. The chalkboard at the front of the hall glowed like an altar. The guest professor was tall, with white hair and a voice that rolled across the room like thunder softened by velvet. He began with a story of how his proof had taken shape. Late nights at his desk, sleepless hours chasing one idea after another until finally, the structure revealed itself in perfect symmetry. The students leaned forward, spellbound. He wrote step after step on the board, each line flowing into the next like a river carrying its own music. Even from the back row, she copied every detail into her notebook. She didn't know every term, but she felt the logic. Each sentence was like a rung in a ladder leading upward. Around her, students whispered their admiration. Some spoke of the professor's genius, others of the beauty of the mathematics itself. She listened quietly, her heart swelling with both awe and longing. Then, halfway through, something happened. It was small, so small that most eyes skimmed over it without pause. A single step in the chain of reasoning, a hidden assumption, buried like a stone under snow. To her, it stood out at once, sharp and undeniable. Her pencil stopped. She stared at the board. Her heart thudded against her ribs. Could it be wrong? Could this great man, this celebrated mind, have overlooked something? She flipped back through her notes. Again and again she traced the steps. The gap remained. It was not imagination. The proof, flawless to everyone else, had a missing piece. Her throat tightened. She felt her hand tremble as it rose slightly off the desk, then sank back down. Around her, students scribbled, nodded, admired. No one else saw it. She whispered to herself, "If I speak, they will laugh. If I stay silent, the truth is lost." Her fingers gripped the edge of the desk until her knuckles whitened. Slowly, painfully, she raised her hand. From the stage, the professor noticed. His brow furrowed slightly. "Yes, young lady, do you have a question?" Every head turned. The hall, filled with hundreds, suddenly seemed unbearably small. Her voice quivered. "Sir, I think there may be a step in your proof that assumes something that hasn't been shown." For a heartbeat, silence. Then the sound came. Laughter. It rolled across the room like a wave, cruel and sharp. "Who is she?" someone whispered. "Isn't that the janitor's kid?" She doesn't even belong here. The girl froze, her face burning. Students nudged one another, smirking, whispering words meant to cut. Farm girl, janitor's child, outsider. The professor raised a hand for quiet, though annoyance flickered in his eyes. What exactly do you believe is missing? She swallowed hard, forcing her voice steady. When you moved from the earlier step to the next, it depends on something you didn't prove. It looks like the conclusion holds only if that condition is already true. The room was still again. A few students frowned, flipping through their notes. Others smirked, waiting for her humiliation. The professor hesitated. His chalk hovered above the board. From her seat at the back, the girl gripped her notebook tightly, her chest aching. She had spoken. The laughter still echoed in her ears, but she had said it aloud. For the first time, the great proof no longer looked untouchable. A seed of doubt had been planted, and the silence in the room was no longer the silence of certainty. It was the silence of minds beginning to question. That night, as she followed her father out into the chill of the New Haven streets, her head hung low. The laughter still stung, but beneath the pain was something else, the faintest flicker of triumph. She had seen what others had not. She had dared to speak. The story was not finished. The world had only just begun to listen. The room held its breath. For a moment, every pair of eyes in the lecture hall was fixed on her, the janitor's daughter, sitting in the back row with her patched coat and worn notebook. The guest professor, a man whose name carried weight in journals and conferences, had paused in mid-sentence. His chalk hovered just above the board, uncertain. She sat frozen. Her hand, still raised, trembled as though carrying not just a question, but the weight of her whole existence. Her heart beat so hard it felt as if it might echo against the stone walls. No one had ever listened to her here before. Not once. She had been the shadow at the edge of classrooms, the ghost slipping through corridors behind her father. And now, she had spoken aloud. The laughter from before still rang in her ears. It had been harsh, merciless, rising from the polished rows of students who belonged in this world of marble arches and leather-bound books. Their voices had mocked her coat, her shoes, her very presence. Janitor's kid, farm girl, outsider, words that stuck like burrs in her skin. And yet, she could not unsee the flaw. Her notebook lay open on her desk. The careful steps of the proof were copied there, line by line. To everyone else it looked perfect, like a cathedral of thought rising into the sky. But at the base, hidden from sight, one stone was missing. Without it, the structure could not stand. The professor finally spoke, his voice even but edged with impatience. You believe a step was assumed without proof? She nodded, her throat too tight for words. Which step? Her voice came out barely above a whisper. The part where the conclusion moved forward. It only works if something is already true, something that wasn't shown. Some students chuckled again, waiting for the professor to crush her with a single explanation. But others frowned, flipping through their notes, searching. A ripple of unease passed across the room. The professor turned back to the board. His chalk tapped lightly as he retraced his own steps. For a long minute, the hall was silent except for the sound of his writing. She lowered her hand slowly, almost wishing she could vanish into her seat. The courage that had carried it upward drained away, leaving only fear. What if she was wrong? What if she had embarrassed herself, and worse, embarrassed her father? Her father. He was outside, somewhere in the corridors, pushing his mop, emptying trash bins. He would never know what she had dared here tonight. But she knew, and that was enough to make her cheeks burn. Perhaps she means this transition, one student murmured. The justification is not obvious. The professor glanced at him, then at the girl. His eyes narrowed. Explain, child.
In your own words. Her pulse thundered. She wanted to sink into the floor, but the request was clear. Slowly she stood, clutching her notebook like a shield. Her voice shook as she began. When you moved from the earlier argument to the next, it looked smooth, but it depends on something hidden. You can only say the conclusion is true if you already assume the condition that makes it possible. It's like saying a bridge will hold without showing the supports underneath. A hush fell. Even those who had laughed earlier now leaned forward. They might not respect her, but her words had drawn a picture they could not ignore. A bridge without supports. A cathedral missing a stone. Everyone understood that image. The professor's jaw tightened. He studied the board, chalk dust gathering on his fingers. Another long silence stretched across the hall. At last he said, "That is an interesting observation." It was not an admission, but it was not dismissal either. The girl sank back into her seat, her hands trembling. She stared down at the eraser her father had given her the night before, the one that had once belonged to her mother. She rubbed its surface with her thumb, grounding herself in its worn edges. Around her, whispers stirred. Some students scoffed, muttering that she was lucky, that she had stumbled upon something by chance. Others remained quiet, unsettled by the thought that a child in a torn coat might have seen what they had not. The professor cleared his throat. "Let us continue." The lecture moved on, but the energy in the room had changed. It was no longer the smooth flow of admiration for a flawless proof. Doubt lingered like a draft through an open window. The girl barely heard the rest. Her body trembled with exhaustion, her mind replaying the moment again and again, the raising of her hand, the wave of laughter, the silence that followed. When the lecture ended, students spilled into the corridors, their voices buzzing with speculation. She slipped out quietly, pressing herself against the wall as clusters passed. Some pointed, others smirked, but a few looked at her with something different. Hesitation, even respect. Outside, the night air was sharp with spring frost. She found her father waiting by his cleaning cart, his face lined with fatigue. He smiled when he saw her, not knowing what had happened inside. "Ready to go, little one?" he asked. She nodded, though her chest ached with the storm of the evening. Together they walked through the stone courtyards, his boots echoing on the cobblestones, her notebook clutched against her chest. As they passed beneath the great iron gates of Yale, she looked back once more at the towers lit against the night. Somewhere inside those walls, her voice had been heard. Not welcomed, not celebrated, but heard. Her hand had risen, trembling but steady enough to point at truth. It was the beginning. The lecture hall at Yale had always carried a kind of hush, the solemn air of knowledge etched into its stone walls. But that night, after her trembling hand rose and her quiet voice cut across the grand proof, the silence broke in a different way. It began as a chuckle. One boy in the front row snorted as if she had told a clumsy joke. Then another joined. Within seconds, the sound spread, a ripple that became a tide, until the entire hall shook with laughter. Not laughter of joy nor even surprise. It was the cruel laughter of disbelief, sharpened by privilege. "There she goes again," someone whispered loudly enough for the back rows to hear. The janitor's daughter correcting a world-famous scholar. "Farm girl thinks she's Einstein." She shrank against her seat, her notebook pressed tight to her chest. The sound rolled over her like cold waves, each laugh striking her ribs harder than words ever could. Her ears burned, her vision blurred. For a moment she wished she had stayed silent. If only she had kept her head down, scribbled in her notebook, and let the world move on without her. Then she would not be sitting in this storm of mockery. The professor, standing at the board, raised his hand sharply.
Quiet! The laughter stuttered, but echoes still lingered in the corners of the hall. A few students bit their lips, still grinning. The professor turned toward her. His voice was measured but cold. You may finish your thought, but understand this is not the place for half-formed guesses. Her knees trembled as she stood, though she barely reached above the rows of heads. I didn't mean disrespect. I only thought, when the argument moved forward, it depended on something that wasn't shown. Her words were halting but steady enough to be heard. More snickers followed.
She read that in a library book, one boy muttered. Or maybe she overheard it while scrubbing floors, another added. The professor ignored them. And what would you suggest instead? He asked, his tone almost mocking. She swallowed. Her voice dropped softer. It would need another step. Something to prove the condition first, before the conclusion can stand. Her fingers twisted the edge of her mother's notebook. Her eyes never met his. Instead, they fixed on the chalk dust clinging to his sleeve. The professor stared at her for a long moment, then turned back to the board. He retraced the lines of his proof, his chalk clicking with practiced precision. The audience waited for him to reveal her mistake, for the swift dismissal that would restore order. But as the chalk moved, the silence deepened. Whispers began to ripple. She might be right. That step isn't clear. Why didn't I see that? The professor's jaw tightened. He tapped the board once, twice. At last he said, It is true that the transition assumes something that has not been fully justified. The room froze. Students looked at each other, the laughter dying in their throats. Some flushed red. Others frowned as though betrayed. The proud structure of certainty had cracked, and the crack had been pointed out not by a scholar, not by a graduate student, but by a child in a torn coat. Yet even then, the cruelty did not stop. She'd just guessed, someone scoffed. Beginner's luck. No way she really understood. The professor cleared his throat and pushed on, refusing to linger on the admission. We will move forward, he said curtly. There is still value in the argument, though perhaps an adjustment is required. The lecture resumed, but the air had changed. Laughter still buzzed faintly, but unease lay beneath it. Students shifted in their seats, casting glances toward the back row where she sat. She lowered herself into her chair, her whole body trembling. The laughter had wounded her deeply, each sound still echoing inside. And yet, beneath the sting, a strange warmth flickered. She had not been wrong. When the lecture ended, she tried to leave quietly, but the crowd pressed around her, whispers following like shadows. Who does she think she is? Someone needs to tell her to stay in her place. She'll never belong here. Her shoulders hunched under the weight of their words. She hurried through the corridor, clutching her notebook so tightly it left marks on her hands. In the courtyard outside, the night air was cool. She leaned against the stone wall, her breath shaking. Her father's figure appeared at the far end, pushing his cart, whistling faintly through tired lips. When he saw her face, his smile faded. What happened? She shook her head. Nothing, Papa. Just noise. He studied her, as though he could read the bruises left by words, but he said nothing more, only placed his rough hand gently on her shoulder. That night, in the small basement room they called home, she opened her notebook again. Her tears fell onto the page, blurring the lines she had written. But she did not tear it out. She pressed the eraser, her mother's old eraser, against the page, as if it could wipe away not the ink, but the cruelty of the world. And in the quiet, a thought returned. They had laughed. But they had also listened. She had seen what even the great had missed. The laughter was not the end. It was only the beginning of something larger, though she could not yet see what shape it would take. The following morning, the story was already spreading through the campus. At first, it traveled in whispers. A janitor's daughter had stood up in a lecture and interrupted one of the most celebrated mathematicians of the century. By afternoon, the whispers turned into laughter in dining halls and study rooms. They mimicked her voice, her trembling hands, her patched coat. But beneath the laughter, doubt lingered. Because those who had been in the lecture hall could not erase the look on the professor's face when he turned back to the board. They remembered how his chalk had paused, how silence had stretched too long, how his words, careful, measured, had admitted that the transition had not been fully justified. By evening, graduate students were already reworking the proof in their notebooks. Some dismissed the question quickly, assuring themselves it was a minor detail. But others, more honest with their own thoughts, felt unease growing like a shadow across the page. The girl herself knew nothing of the debates buzzing around Yale. She had spent the day in her father's small apartment, doing laundry in the cracked sink, running errands, and then curling in the corner with her notebook. Her mind replayed the moment again and again. The laughter, the sting of cruelty, and then the professor's reluctant words. It is true that the transition assumes something not fully justified. She traced those words on the page with her finger until they seemed carved into her skin. That night, she returned with her father to the campus. He carried his mop and bucket. She carried her notebook. When the great iron gates of Yale creaked shut behind them, the place seemed different. She no longer felt invisible. In the main mathematics building, lights still glowed in offices. Students gathered in small groups, their voices tense, papers spread across desks. She lingered by the doorways, catching fragments of sentences. "Did you check that condition again?" "She might have been right, you know." No, someone like her couldn't have seen it." The words were daggers and balm all at once. They dismissed her, but they could not dismiss what she had said. The next day, the guest professor himself called for a special session. The lecture hall filled again, more crowded than before. Even professors from other departments slipped in, curiosity written on their faces. At the back, she sat beside her father, who had left his cart in the corridor. He squeezed her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "Just listen," he whispered. The guest professor began with dignity, his voice steady, though his eyes betrayed weariness. "Yesterday, there was a question raised regarding a step in the proof I presented. Today, I wish to address it directly." A hush fell over the room. He retraced his argument line by line until he reached the very step she had pointed to. He paused, chalk in hand. "Here," he said, "was the issue. The condition I moved forward with was not, in fact, established in the prior steps. The young lady in the audience was correct to notice it." The room froze. No one laughed. No one dared. The professor continued, his voice lower now, almost defensive. "It does not destroy the entire result. The essence of the proof may still hold, but adjustments are required. A missing support must be added to carry the structure. Without it, yes, the conclusion falls." A murmur spread, not of mockery this time, but of shock. Students exchanged glances. Professors shifted uneasily in their seats. At the back of the hall, the girl's heart pounded. Her father squeezed her hand again. She wanted to disappear and to shine all at once. The professor's lecture ended quickly after that. He gathered his papers with unusual haste, his face pale. He did not look toward the back of the hall, but the silence he left behind was louder than any applause. In the courtyard afterward, clusters of students debated fiercely. "How could we all have missed it?" one demanded. "She didn't prove anything. She just spotted a crack." "Yes," another admitted, "but sometimes spotting the crack is the hardest part." The girl walked quietly beside her father, her notebook clutched close. She heard every word, but spoke none herself. Her father finally broke the silence. "You see, little one, the truth doesn't care about coats or shoes. The truth belongs to whoever is willing to see it." She blinked hard against the tears that stung her eyes. For once, the shame of laughter no longer weighed heavier than the joy of discovery. That night, in their basement apartment, she opened her notebook to a fresh page. With careful letters, she wrote, "Even the great can overlook. Even the small can reveal." She set the notebook beside her bed. For the first time in many nights, she slept without fear of dreams. The next morning, a new whisper ran through Yale, not of laughter this time, but of astonishment. A girl no one had known, a child of the janitor, had uncovered a flaw in a proof that scholars had praised for years. The campus was no longer laughing, it was listening. The morning after the special lecture, the campus of Yale seemed to hum with unease. The great towers stood as proudly as ever, but the air around them was charged, as if the very stones had absorbed the shock of the night before. A child, no, worse, a janitor's child, had pointed out a flaw in a celebrated proof. For some, it was thrilling, even liberating. For others, it was unbearable. At first, the debates stayed inside classrooms. Graduate students argued in low voices, their notebooks open. She was right, some admitted reluctantly. It was a missing condition. Others bristled. Anyone could find a loose thread if they tug long enough. That doesn't make her a mathematician. By midday, the whispers turned into open resistance. "She didn't prove anything," one professor told his colleagues at lunch. "She just interrupted. That's not scholarship, it's chance." Another added sharply, "Do you realize what this does to our reputation? That a child with no formal training claims to correct a proof we've taught for years?" The word "claims" hung heavy, as though the professor himself hadn't seen the missing step with his own eyes. For the girl, the day passed quietly. She accompanied her father on his rounds, sweeping staircases and emptying bins. She kept her notebook tucked under her arm, listening without speaking. Everywhere she walked, she felt eyes on her. Curious, doubtful, sometimes hostile. In one corridor, a group of students blocked her way. Their voices dripped with scorn. "So, genius," one said. "What are you going to correct next? Newton? Einstein? Maybe you'll rewrite the whole library?" Another laughed. "Don't get used to it. One lucky guess doesn't make you special." She lowered her gaze, clutching her notebook tighter. Her father stepped between them, his shoulders tense. "She's done nothing to you," he said quietly. The boys scoffed and walked off, their laughter echoing down the hallway. But their words lingered like smoke. That evening, professors gathered in a private room, their voices hushed but heated. Some argued that the flaw was real and should be acknowledged openly. Others resisted fiercely. "To admit this child found it is to invite ridicule," one insisted. "Better to say the gap was already known," another suggested, "that it is only a detail, not a discovery." "And if she keeps showing up," someone asked bitterly, "do we let a janitor's daughter dictate our mathematics?" Silence fell. No one said it aloud, but the thought was clear. She had crossed a line not of knowledge, but of class. She was not one of them, and they could not let her become one of them. Back in their basement home, the girl sat by the flickering flame of the oil lamp. Her father was mending a tear in his work shirt, his hands clumsy with the needle. She stared at her notebook, the pages filled with her careful writing. "Papa," she whispered, "maybe they're right. Maybe it was just luck." He set the shirt aside and looked at her with tired, steady eyes. "Luck?" he said softly. "Do you know how many nights I've seen you hunched over those pages, lips moving as though each number was a prayer?" Luck doesn't wear out pencils until they are stubs. Luck doesn't copy pages in the dark when others are sleeping. No, little one. That wasn't luck. That was you. Her eyes stung. She wanted to believe him. But the echoes of laughter and scorn were louder. The resistance grew. Some professors began rewriting the proof, deliberately ignoring her contribution. In whispered conversations, they described the missing step as a technical oversight, already known in certain circles, even though it had never been published. Students repeated the new story eagerly. It wasn't her. The experts knew all along. Yet in private, doubts still gnawed. Graduate students continued to pore over the details, and a few admitted quietly that they had learned something new because of her tea. But to say it aloud was dangerous. The girl felt the change in the air whenever she walked through campus with her father. Where there had been curiosity, there was now hostility. Some sneered openly. Others looked through her as if she were not there at all. Still, she carried her notebook. Still, she filled its pages. One night, unable to sleep, she wrote a single sentence across the top of a page. Truth does not depend on who speaks it. She underlined it twice, her small hand steady in the dim light. But resistance, like fire, spreads. The next week, an article appeared in the student newspaper. It described the lecture, but the girl's name, or even the fact that she was the janitor's daughter, was missing. The piece framed the gap in the proof as a minor correction noticed by several observers. Her father read it aloud, his voice heavy. "They've erased you," he murmured. She sat silently, staring at the table. Something inside her tightened, not with despair, but with quiet determination. "They can erase my name," she said softly, "but not the truth." Her father reached across the table, his rough fingers closing over her small hand. "And one day, the truth will carry your name whether they want it or not." The resistance had begun. It would not end quickly. But beneath the stone arches of Yale, beneath the laughter and the denial, something irreversible had happened. A child had spoken. A flaw had been revealed. And no resistance, no matter how fierce, could silence it forever. Whispers are light at first. They drift like smoke, invisible, almost harmless. But at Yale, whispers had a way of growing into storms. After the guest lecture, after the professor's reluctant admission, the whispers about the janitor's daughter spread faster than spring rain across the cobblestones. At first, they carried curiosity. "Who is she?" students asked each other. "Did you hear about the girl who found a flaw?" Some were amazed, others unsettled. But soon curiosity soured into something harsher. "She didn't prove anything," one boy scoffed in the dining hall. "She just guessed." "I heard she cheats," another claimed. "She probably steals notes from professors' offices." Someone else leaned in with a smirk. "Or maybe she copies answers from books she doesn't understand." Day by day, the story shifted. The more it spread, the less it resembled the truth. By the time it reached the farthest corners of the campus, she was no longer the quiet girl in a patched coat who had spoken up. She was a fraud, a thief, a child of luck at best, dishonesty at worst. One morning, as she followed her father into the lecture halls, she noticed new graffiti scratched onto the wall near the stairwell. "Stay in your place, janitor's kid." Her father's jaw tightened when he saw it. He took a rag from his cart, dipped it in soapy water, and began scrubbing. His shoulders shook with effort, though his voice stayed calm. "Don't look at it, little one. Dirt washes away." But she saw. She always saw. The backlash grew sharper. In classrooms, professors who had once been intrigued now avoided the subject entirely. Some even went further, dismissing the flaw as a trivial detail that had long been known.
Of course we were aware, one lecturer told his students. The child simply stumbled into repeating what scholars already understood. But the students remembered. They remembered the silence in the hall, the chalk frozen in the professor's hand. They remembered the admission, spoken aloud, that the condition had not been justified. Still, few dared to challenge their teachers. For the girl, the air grew heavier each time she stepped onto campus. Whispers followed her down corridors. Laughter sometimes trailed behind. She carried her notebook closer to her chest, as though it might shield her from the weight of their scorn. One evening, she found a group of older students waiting outside the lecture hall. Their faces were twisted with smugness. "So, Prodigy," one said, "tell us what you've discovered today. Any more miracles in that little notebook of yours?" She shook her head, trying to slip past, but another boy blocked her path. "You think you're smarter than us? Than professors? You're nothing. Just the janitor's kid pretending to be something." The words cut, not because they were new, but because they echoed the voices already inside her. Her father appeared then, pushing his cart down the hall. His eyes narrowed. "Leave her alone," he said, his voice low but firm. The boys laughed, bowing mockingly. "Yes, sir. We'll leave the princess of the mop alone." Then they vanished down the stairwell. Her father touched her shoulder gently. "You must not listen," he whispered. But he could see she already had. That night, in their basement apartment, she sat at the table with her notebook open, but her pencil unmoving. Her father stirred a pot of thin soup, watching her from the corner of his eye. "Do you remember what your mother used to tell you?" he asked softly. The girl shook her head. "She said truth is like a candle. Wind may make it flicker, shadows may hide it, but if you protect it, it will never go out." The girl's eyes filled with tears. "But Papa, what if no one believes the candle is real?" Her father came to her side, placing a rough hand on her hair. "Belief doesn't change the flame. It only changes the eyes that see it." She closed her notebook. She couldn't write that night. By the end of the week, the backlash reached its cruelest form. A formal statement was circulated among faculty, framing the flaw as a matter of interpretation, and declaring that no substantial contribution had been made. Her name was not mentioned. She had been erased again. Students read the statement with relief, their laughter returning. "See?" they told each other. She was nothing, just noise. But not everyone believed. In quiet corners of the library, in dorm rooms lit late at night, a few students whispered differently. "She was right," they admitted. "They just don't want to say it." The girl knew nothing of the statement until her father read it aloud to her one evening. His voice was flat, but his hands shook as he held the paper. She listened in silence. When he finished, she closed her eyes. The laughter, the whispers, the graffiti, all of it pressed against her. For a moment she felt herself shrinking, smaller and smaller, until she was no bigger than the flame of the candle her father had spoken of. But then she opened her notebook. She turned to the page where she had written in careful letters, "Even the great can overlook, even the small can reveal." She traced the words with her finger. They did not erase the pain, but they steadied her hand. "They can say what they want," she whispered. "The truth is still the truth." Her father's tired eyes glistened with pride. He leaned forward and kissed the crown of her head. "That's my girl." The backlash had tried to bury her, but beneath the weight of denial and ridicule, something stubborn remained, a flame that would not be put out. And soon, that flame would draw the attention of someone who saw not her rags, but her brilliance. For days after the statement was released, the girl walked Yale's corridors like a shadow. Her patched coat drew stares, Her presence drew whispers, but her notebook never left her hands. She wrote in it each night by the dim glow of the oil lamp, though some nights the pages blurred with tears she tried not to shed. One evening, while her father scrubbed the marble steps of the main hall, she sat quietly in a corner, her back against the cold stone wall. She had opened her notebook to an unfinished problem, something about how infinite sums can behave differently depending on how you add them together. She traced the lines with her pencil but could not bring herself to finish. Her mind replayed the laughter, the graffiti, the professor's dismissal. Maybe they're right. Maybe I am nothing but a shadow at the door. Interesting choice of problem. The voice startled her. She looked up to see an older man standing nearby, his white hair swept neatly back, his glasses glinting under the hall light. He wore no smile, but neither did his face carry the sneer she had come to expect. She stammered, clutching her notebook to her chest. I was just copying. He tilted his head. No, you were thinking. I've watched you. Her breath caught. Watched me? I sit in the back sometimes when you slip into the lecture halls. I see the way you write. You're not just collecting notes, you're working with them, questioning them. His gaze dropped to her notebook. May I? She hesitated, then slowly held it out. His hands were steady as he turned the pages. Line after line of her handwriting filled the worn paper. Problems, half-finished proofs, careful explanations written in the margin. He nodded slowly as he read. This is not copying, he said at last. This is the work of a mind that belongs here. Her throat tightened. But they say, I don't belong, that it was just luck. The man closed the notebook gently and handed it back. Luck does not leave pages like these. Talent does. And discipline. He paused. Do you know who I am? She shook her head. My name is Professor Samuel Harrington. I have taught mathematics here for 30 years, and I was in the hall the night you raised your hand. Her cheeks flushed. She looked down. Everyone laughed. Yes, he said quietly, but not everyone dismissed you. She dared to look up then. His eyes were stern, yet kind, like someone who had weathered storms and learned which truths survived them. Child, he continued, the Academy resists what does not fit its story. You do not fit. You are young, poor, the daughter of a janitor. They will say you cannot be what you already are. Her eyes blurred with tears. Then what should I do? Keep asking. Keep writing. Keep noticing what others overlook. And when they laugh, remember that laughter is often the last defense against fear. She clutched her notebook tightly. Fear? Yes. They fear you because you remind them that truth is not locked behind their gates. It can rise from anywhere, even from the child of a gatekeeper. The words sank deep, like roots finding water in dry soil. From that night on, Professor Harrington began to meet her quietly. Sometimes in empty classrooms after dusk, sometimes in corners of the library no one visited. He brought her books discarded by students who had moved on, pages filled with dust, but also with light. Together they worked through problems she had only dreamed of touching. He explained with patience, not rushing, not mocking, always allowing her to think before he spoke. One evening they discussed the nature of infinity, how some infinities are larger than others. She listened in awe as he told her the story of Cantor, a mathematician who had been mocked in his own time for daring to suggest such things. They laughed at him too, Harrington said softly. But he was right, and history remembers the truth, not the laughter. The girl held those words close, as though they were a shield. But not everyone was pleased with Harrington's attention. Other professors noticed. Why waste your time on her? One scoffed. She is a distraction, nothing more. She is a child, another said sharply. You risk your reputation. Harrington's reply was steady. I would risk my reputation 100 times if it means nurturing a mind like hers. And so the resistance against her grew sharper, but so too did the quiet protection around her. Her father noticed the change. He saw her eyes brighten again when she opened her notebook, saw the way she hurried to meet Harrington after his shifts. One evening, as they walked home together, he asked, "Do you trust him?" She nodded. "He listens, Papa. He doesn't laugh." Her father smiled faintly. "Then perhaps he is the answer to your mother's prayers." Weeks passed. The campus still whispered, but whispers no longer crushed her as they once had, for she knew now she was not alone. Behind her, like a sheltering tree, stood the unlikely mentor who had chosen to see beyond rags and ridicule. One night, as she closed her notebook after another long session, she wrote a single line across the page. Not everyone who laughs is right. Not everyone who listens is wrong. She underlined it twice. The flame her father spoke of was no longer flickering. It was beginning to grow. The proof that had once been untouchable no longer stood as it had before. For weeks, the professors of Yale worked in quiet urgency, their chalkboards covered in fresh lines, their desks stacked with crumpled drafts. What had seemed flawless now required repair, and the missing stone that held up the cathedral of reasoning had to be replaced. But the world outside would not wait. Journals had begun to ask questions. Scholars at other universities wanted clarifications. The flaw was not just a rumor now, it was a fact. And in every retelling, one name lingered, even when unspoken. The janitor's daughter. Professor Harrington worked late nights in his office. Papers spread like maps before him. The girl sat nearby, her notebook open, pencil moving steadily. She offered small observations, not bold claims, gentle questions about what supported what, where a step leaned too heavily on air. He listened, and more often than not, her questions pointed the way. One evening, after weeks of work, Harrington leaned back in his chair. His gray eyes softened. "It is done," he murmured. She looked up. "The proof?" "The rewrite," he said, holding up the stack of pages. "The argument now stands, and in its margin, your note will stand too." Her breath caught. "My note?" "Your words," he said firmly. "The truth must carry the name of the one who revealed it." Tears blurred her vision. She touched the pages as if they might vanish. "But they'll never allow it." Harrington's jaw tightened. "Then let them resist. History has longer memory than pride." The announcement came quietly. A revised version of the famous proof was submitted to a respected journal. At the bottom of the text, beneath the neat lines of reasoning, was a short acknowledgement. The initial oversight was observed by a young student, the daughter of a Yale employee, whose careful attention reminded us all that truth often arrives from unexpected voices. It was not her name, but it was her. When the girl read the words, her heart trembled. For the first time, she was not erased. She was seen. The backlash did not vanish overnight. Some professors still muttered that she had been lucky, others that Harrington had exaggerated her role. Yet the rewrite stood, printed in black and white, beyond denial. And though many tried to bury her story, it seeped quietly into the cracks of conversation. "Have you heard?" one graduate student whispered to another. "They say the janitor's daughter was right." The girl heard these whispers too, but now they no longer crushed her. They simply reminded her that truth, once spoken, cannot be taken back. On the final day of the semester, Yale's campus glowed beneath the soft light of spring.
The courtyards rang with voices of students rushing to exams, their futures spread wide before them. The girl walked slowly beside her father, his keys jangling at his belt, his hands rough from years of scrubbing stone and polishing brass. They passed beneath the great arch of the gate where she had so often lowered her head, afraid of the stairs, ashamed of the whispers. But today, her chin was lifted. She carried no banner, no certificate, only her worn notebook with its pages filled in her small, steady script. Yet within her, she carried something greater, the knowledge that she had spoken truth in the face of laughter, and that truth had endured. Her father paused at the gate. He looked at her, pride softening the deep lines of his face. "You walk differently today," he said. She smiled. "Because I am not afraid anymore." Together they stepped through the gate, the sunlight falling warm across their shoulders. She was still the janitor's daughter, still poor, still wrapped in a patched coat. But in her heart burned a quiet certainty. She was also something more. She was a seeker of truth, and truth had answered her. Years later, when her story was told again, the details would blur. The exact lecture, the precise flaw, the names of those who mocked her. But one image remained unshakable. A young girl, rising from the back row, hand trembling yet steady enough to reveal what others had missed. And for those who heard the story, it lit a candle, a reminder that brilliance is not bound by wealth or place, that even the smallest voice can echo through the halls of power, carrying truth with it. Thank you, dear listener, for walking with us through every step of this story. You have sat in the quiet halls of Yale, heard the laughter of the proud, and felt the trembling courage of a child who dared to raise her hand. You have carried her notebook, page by page, through nights of doubt and mornings of resilience. And you have seen her flame, small at first but steady, grow into a light that could not be hidden. Stories like hers are not only about mathematics or classrooms or gates of stone. They are about the human spirit, about how truth can rise from the humblest places and how the smallest voices can remind the world to listen. If you have stayed with me until this moment, I hope you carry something of her story with you. A little warmth, a little strength, and the reminder that dignity and brilliance belong to all, no matter where they are born. From my heart to yours, thank you for listening.